Ian MacGregor, chairman of the British Steel Corporation. Tonight he tells TV Eye of his hopes and fears for his beleaguered industry. Good evening. A critical week in the fortunes of British Steel and in the career of the man who runs it. Tonight, in his first major television interview since his appointment, Ian MacGregor will be talking to Llew Gardner. Yesterday, in the House of Commons, a serious charge against Mr MacGregor was referred to the Committee of Privileges. The charge was that Mr MacGregor had threatened to end further investment in the Workington area if Workington's MP didn't stop attacking managing decisions by British Steel. Tomorrow is the closing date for two ballots of urgent significance, one conducted by the management of British Steel and one by the industry's biggest union, the Iron and Steel Trades Confederation. Both ballots are seeking a verdict on British Steel's survival plan, a streamlining exercise that involves the close down of plants and the loss of 20,000 jobs. So a dramatic week for the corporation and for its 68-year-old chairman, whose very appointment was a matter of immediate controversy. In 1976, British Steel had a workforce of 210,000. At the start of this year, the figure has dropped to 130,000. The reduction now proposed would push it down by another 20,000 to 110,000.
Mr MacGregor, you have spoken more than once of the possibility of liquidation. Do you seriously believe that any government would liquidate British Steel?
I don't think it's a question of the government's wish or intent. Liquidation is a word of art, if you will, that when a business stops moving forward and starts to lose markets and isn't able to compete, a process sets in which is very difficult to reverse and ultimately ends up in the business coming to a standstill one way or the other.
Is British Steel near that situation?
Well, we could say that we are faced with that kind of a situation if we are not able to become sufficiently competitive to continue to command markets.
We've been here before, haven't we, Mr MacGregor? Your predecessors each had a plan to save the steel industry. I sat in this very studio with Sir Charles Villiers, who unfolded his plan. How can the steel workers, how can the public be sure you've got it right this time?
They can't. I have merely suggested that from the alternatives that seem to be clear to us at the moment, and from some assessments of the potential markets ahead, which make some very important assumptions with regard to the continuation of many of our industries, recovery from the massive destocking that took place in the last part of last year. We're assuming that there will be some kind of recovery, and we're trying to gauge that, and our plan is based on an assessment of that situation.
And on guesswork?
All plans are based on some assumptions, all business plans, because if we were able to perceive the future absolutely clearly, we'd be making money like it's going out of style.
You have said that if it doesn't work, if it hasn't come good by the middle of the year, there are harsher decisions to be made. How much harsher?
Oh, they're very substantially harsher. This plan, of course, is gauged also on the fact that we've received quite dramatic improvements in performance in many of the factories, which gives me the confidence to suggest that we should try to continue that progress.
Is this really your plan, Mr MacGregor, or were you restricted by the government, fearful of the social consequences of you going further at this stage?
No, the plan has been produced not by me, but my colleagues working together on each piece of the business.
But didn't they want to go further in the first place?
No, I don't think there was any such arrangement. These figures came together as a result of a careful assessment of the opportunities ahead of each part of the business, including some projection of the kind of improvement that we had been obtaining from the cooperation of our colleagues on the shop floor in the last 6 months.
So what I think I'm really saying to you is that as chairman of a nationalised industry, are you not constantly aware of the political pressures, and don't you find these pressures somewhat inhibiting?
I'm always aware of the political pressures around, a fair number of them, but we have to keep our eye on the horizon. It's rather like piloting a plane. You may be going through a thunderstorm, but if you sit looking at the thunderstorm, you aren't going to be very successful.
we refer perhaps to some of the political pressures of the last week. I wouldn't ask you, of course, to refer in detail at all to your reply to the privilege issue raised by Mr. Campbell-Savers. But however that turns out, isn't this an example of the political tightrope that you have to walk? And isn't it also acutely embarrassing that something like this should happen when you're seeking money from the government?
I'm not going to comment on that, sir.
Not at all?
Not at all.
Do you find the political pressures that do exist in this country unusual, difficult to work in after your experiences of American business?
No, all business works under pressure of one form or another. That's been the development of the post-war 20th century.
I wonder whether you like politicians, though.
Well, politicians have a part to play in the scheme of things. They're supposed to integrate the thoughts and ideas of their constituents and express these in a form which will try to produce the consensus in our democratic society. And therefore, there's nothing unusual about that.
You suggest that they should keep in that particular cubbyhole to which you put them?
No, I think they obviously have to learn about the outer world, and they have to know exactly about the needs of their constituents. They have to spend a great deal of time on learning what's going on around them.
Do you find that they know enough of what's going on around them?
Oh, I think many of them are extremely well informed and knowledgeable people.
Here you are, Mr. MacGregor, a man who's dedicated most of his working life to the pursuit, the very successful pursuit, it might be said, of private enterprise system, the capitalist system, raw and naked in America, which you've done well. Late in life, you find yourself in charge of a nationalized industry. Do you believe in nationalization?
Well, I don't think that it's proved to be the most successful way to run any big business. I think that the evidence would seem to raise some questions about that as being the solution to the business. But even Adam Smith said there were certain things the government might have to pick up.
Would you have picked up steel if you'd been making the decisions at the time it was made?
I don't know. I haven't assessed that carefully, but there's no question about it that British industry, which was based on engineering in the post-war period, certainly needed the support of a sound steel industry with a very diverse base and a strong technological capability.
But, if I may put it to you again, you're not the most enthusiastic nationaliser, are you? Isn't it a bit odd that you're running this industry now?
I wouldn't say so, well, except that maybe it's difficult to find people who will take on these exposed positions.
Why on earth did you take it on?
Well, I won't go into that because your program isn't long enough and there may be other more important questions.
But there must have been some aspect of personal challenge about it, was there not?
Well, yes, I have long watched from afar with distress at the continuing deterioration of the British industrial base and its loss of competitive position in the world. And I felt that there must be something to be done to help turn that around.
What made you think you were the man to do it?
Well, you know, we all have personal vanity.
If I may return to the plan and the closures, how do you decide where closures should take place? Is the judgment made solely on the efficiency or otherwise of a plant, or do you take into consideration such factors as the attitude of the workforce, whether they are bolshy or placid?
Well, we cannot take into account the attitude of the workforce in terms of, if you will, their ideology, but we can take into account the attitude of the workforce in the degree to which they enthusiastically try to help solve the problems which affect themselves and their futures.
Are they beginning to do that? Are you finding a change of attitude in the workforce?
No, I think it's always been there. I think it's been obscured because of the fact that we've all, until quite recently, lived a fairly comfortable life and didn't have to worry about alternatives.
Yet I saw you in a recent magazine interview. You said you spoke of the Japanese addiction to perfection and said that culture didn't exist in Britain. And you also said that the work ethic was unpopular here. Has that been the root of our problems?
I think there's been a tendency in this country to assume that we had it made and therefore we could have a much less strenuous time, and work was a sort of secondary consideration. And what has happened, that with a bump we've all discovered that that isn't necessarily so. We still have to work for our living and we still have to be competitive.
Well, that's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it, of course, might be to say that this change, if there is change in the workforce, has taken place because of an atmosphere of fear, a fear of losing their jobs, and that if that atmosphere was to change, then the attitude of the workforce might change back again.
Oh, I'm not sure about that. I think that there is a much more intelligent base in the British workforce than just being motivated by what you might call primary instinct, such as fear. I think people are very much more intelligent than that.
There is fear around just now, is there not, Mr.
No,
MacGregor?
there's fear always in our lives. That goes back to the Stone Age. I mean, you never knew whether you're going to go around the corner and run into a polar bear.
Here you are.
You had little defense against that.
Here you are, Mr. MacGregor, past retirement age, drawing a salary of $48,000 a year, making the kind of decision that will put 20,000 men out of work, for good reasons or ill reasons, as the case may be. Do you lose sleep over them, or do you just decide what needs to be done must be done?
I'm obviously concerned that when these problems surface and we have to make very tough decisions of this kind, these are not made in a vacuum. They're made after a careful study of all of the alternatives that we know about. And from that we derive what is the only course left to us. That is very much the last resort in our business planning.
There are going to be more redundancies, more than 20,000, aren't there?
Nobody knows at this moment. I wouldn't want to make any guesses. I just feel...
The whole thing is based on guesses, you were telling me earlier, Mr. MacGregor. Why not make this guess?
Well, I'm not prepared to make that guess at the moment. I have to do my homework more thoroughly.
Drawing on your American experience, can you say to us what's wrong with British Steel? Is it the British generally? Is it the workforce, the unions, management, or is it the very fact of nationalisation? Have you been able to put your finger on one thing?
Oh yes, it is that we have not, until recently, been as efficient as we should be. We're not low-cost producers, and therefore our place in the market was slipping as others came up with lower-cost materials, and in some instances our quality wasn't as good as it should have been because it didn't meet the standards set by some of our competitors.
These are the reasons, they're not the causes. Is there something deep in the British psyche that is causing this?
No, I don't think so, because this country has produced some of the most excellent performance in many fields. Craftsmanship has been one of the hallmarks of the British technological workforce, and I don't think that it's disappeared. I think it's just a little bit under the surface. We've got to get it back there.
You've talked about the change of attitude among the workforce. Do you detect the same change of attitude in all the trade union leaders that you meet?
Not all of them, but there is, I think, a growing body of them understand the necessity for improved efficiency in this economy in order to provide the kind of wealth that their members should enjoy.
I mean, you've deliberately, with this ballot, the result of which we'll know tomorrow, you've gone over the heads of the trade union leaders. Is this because you believe that they are out of touch with their members, or they are not the best people to talk to on this subject?
No, we talk to them, but we also feel that it's important to get a feel for what goes on the part of the workforce. After all, they're on our payroll. They should be entitled to the same consideration as everyone else in the business.
You see, the ISTC, the Iron and Steel Trades Confederation, they complain rather bitterly that you didn't consult them before you put this plan forward. Why didn't you consult them?
I didn't know that I didn't consult them.
Well, they seem to think that you didn't.
Well, that is a matter of difference of opinion.
But there does seem to be still a continued rift, particularly between you and the ISTC. Is this a hangover from the strike, which was not your responsibility, of course? Do you think that's the possibility?
Well, that's an interesting suggestion. It may be. I have never found an explanation for their rather diffident approach to things. We have excellent cooperation from most of the union leaders who are happy to sit down and discuss with us the problems we have to face.
But this is the largest union, isn't it? How are you going to...
It may be the largest union.
Haven't you got to heal that breach? Isn't that rather important?
I think that in the future, that will be a matter which should be thought about by them as well as us.
Are they in the 20th century, Mr. Sears and his executive, do you think?
Well, now, I wouldn't like to comment on that. I don't know that I'm in the 20th century. I may be either in the 18th or the 21st.
Don't you comment by not commenting? Wouldn't it be better when you, instead of squabbling with the unions, that you joined with the unions in a campaign to bring down interest rates, to give British Steel some of the subsidies on energy, transport and research that is enjoyed by other foreign competitors? Wouldn't that kind of joint campaign be a useful exercise?
Well, that's quite a basket question, but let me try and deal with some of the pieces in it. First of all, I don't know that we're squabbling with the unions. I told you that the bulk of our union leaders have sat down with us and worked out more or less the details of the plan. So I don't know what that squabble is that you refer to. Secondly, the question of approaching the government. We spend all of our time working with the ministry and our own industry ministry and other ministries on the problems that affect British Steel, looking for solutions. For example, on the cost of energy. We're one of the biggest consumers in energy in this country. One of our problems is to make sure that we get that energy at costs that are comparable with the costs that our competitors pay. And as you know,
at the present you don't.
Well, there's a little bit of research being done by NATO right at the moment to try to determine if that is the case or isn't. My general feeling is that we do have higher costs than many of our competitors. It's not a question of subsidies or lack of subsidies, a question of the philosophy of pricing of utilities to big users.
I'm not quite sure I know what that means.
Well, obviously, when we take electricity from a generating station, we don't have a network of wires that goes halfway across the country. The cost of distribution to us is very tiny compared with the cost of distribution to Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Smith, and all our neighbors 25, 30, 40 miles away.
You're saying you're paying too much and you would like it down.
I would like to pay my fair share, and I think that we'd like to see a good return to the Electricity Council and a good return on the investment that they use to provide us with that service. But I don't know that I can carry too many other people along with me.
Your fair share would be less than it is now.
I suspect it would.
Now, can we talk about interest rates? Aren't interest rates an enormous burden on you, and aren't interest rates helping to cripple you just as much, perhaps, as carrying extra men and inefficient methods?
Well, interest rates are a burden to British Steel, but as you perhaps know, we're attempting to reconstitute the capital of British Steel in the next few months, which will take into account how much capital is actually left in the business and what cost we should pay for that to the government.
You have made some talk of to the government of bringing down interest rates. Do you get a sympathetic ear when you make these points to them?
You mean on the money that's lent to British
Yes.
Steel, or in general?
In general.
Well, interest rates in general is not a subject that I think that I would like to debate here, but you can get both sides of that question. Highest interest rates in the world are now being paid in the United States, in the industrial world, so that we're not all that ill done by. Interest rates are high across the world because of the fact that money is deteriorating at such a rapid rate. I don't think interest rates have really changed since the year 1000. They're about the same. They're about 5%. But you have to add on a piece to pay for the cost of the money that gets lost each year as our currency is eroded.
What do you say to those critics who say that your production target of 14.4 million tonnes envisages a kind of continuance of the siege economy we have at the moment, and when better times come, our steel production will be woefully short, say 6-7 million tonnes short of Britain's needs, and we will have to import yet more steel?
Well, I don't think that is an accurate assessment. I think our plan is an attempt to come to a balance between the requirements of today and what we project for maybe a year ahead. We have to make some guesses, which you'd like, as to the future.
Only a year ahead.
Well, I have to start with the first year. I don't think anyone can see too clearly more than 12 months ahead in our business.
And yet a number of experts in the world have suggested that, in fact, by the mid-80s or even before that, there will be an upturn in the world demand for steel. And won't we then be found lacking and unable to contribute and to take our share of this upturn?
Well, we have a certain amount of potential up our sleeves, I would say.
Not if you close plants.
No, you'd be surprised. Nothing would make me happier than to have too many orders. I think we'd surprise you.
What are you saying to me, Mr. MacGregor, that 14.4 isn't definitive, that if there was an upturn you could in fact meet an increased demand?
There are ways to achieve a great deal more production out of our facilities. You know, blast furnaces are sometimes run for minimum cost. Other times they're run for maximum production. These two things are quite different.
So you could meet more demand?
Yes.
You said recently, Mr. MacGregor, and we come to the end of the interview, you said recently you were offered your job because you were one of the few foolhardy enough to take it. Are you now foolhardy enough to say that you will succeed?
Well, I didn't come here for the purpose of liquidating British Steel, even though we talked about liquidation to start with. My intention is to try to do the opposite, because the future of this country depends on this very essential raw material being produced for our engineering industries at a cost that makes them world competitive. And if we don't do that, many, many jobs are at hazard.
Mr. MacGregor, thank you very much indeed. That's all from us tonight, except to say that since we came on air and using Mr. MacGregor's own recently published figures, we calculate that British Steel has lost £46,000, and that is Mr. MacGregor's problem. Good night.